We need to be visible. We need to be off session, calling your delegates, calling your senators, showing your face to them, letting them see who you are. Be visible so that when these attacks come, and they will, they know what they're up against. And we weren't expecting it to be so soon or so mighty.
Welcome to Homeschool Talks, a podcast by HSLDA. This is a show about all things homeschooling, from practical tips to inspiring stories and everything in between. You can find show notes for this episode along with our other Homeschool Talks conversations at hslda.org/podcast. And if you want to be the first to know about new episodes as well as upcoming guests and topics, sign up for our email list using the link in the show notes. We're so glad you've joined us today, and we hope you enjoyed the program. Here's your host, Jim Mason.
Hi, I'm Jim Mason, president of Homeschool Legal Defense Association, and this is another episode of Homeschool Talks, where I get to talk to interesting people in the world of homeschooling and find out more about what they're doing and to give you an idea of what's really going on all over the country in the homeschooling world. Today, I'm very pleased to be joined by Callie Chaplow, who is the Director of Government Affairs at the Home Educators Association of Virginia, HEAV. Our office is located here in Virginia, and so they do a lot of very important work that has actually affected my family and our homeschooling career over the years. So welcome, Callie.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
So Callie, tell us, what's your connection to homeschooling in your personal life?
Well, let's see. My oldest homeschooled child is now a sophomore in college, so he started from the ground up. My first close exposure to homeschooling was in the legislature. I worked as a legislative aide for a delegate who was very pro homeschooling, and so he would frequently tell people, you need to have a big family and you need to homeschool. So long before I was ever married or had children, I became interested. And then I live here in Loudoun County as well. So I was obviously familiar with HSLDA and the work that your organization does.
And you mentioned you worked for a delegate here in Virginia, and you're actually right now quite involved in homeschool advocacy in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Tell us, how did that start and what are you up to these days?
Yeah, it's been really exciting. I've kind of ended up in a position where I've come full circle. So I used to work for Dick Black, and we carried a lot of homeschool legislation. And then came the time where I got married and started having my own children. And I had been to HEAV's convention. I had worked with Yvonne Bunn, who's my predecessor, and their different lobbyists over the years, carrying their legislation with then Delegate Black. I worked for him as a senator as well. But so the time came to homeschool, but I was scared. I bought into this idea about what about socialization. My oldest son was very shy. He wanted to go to story time at the library, but wanted to stay in my lap. So I needed to figure out how to do this. So I took myself back to HEAV's convention this time as a mom, and went to Yvonne Bunn's How to Begin a Homeschooling and Know the Law, familiarized myself with that. And there began our journey. And since compulsory attendance isn't, you can get around it with little guys. I thought, well, it's kindergarten. If it's a total failure, he's already reading, we'll just send him to first grade. But we fell in love.
Yeah.
So there began my homeschooling. And then, here I am many years later. My kids are older. And I'm a single mom, so I'm in a position where I need to be working. And HEAV approached me and said, Yvonne Bunn's getting ready to retire. Is this something you would be interested in doing? So, there's some fill in the blank there because I was so excited. This was my dream job. But then I was a little fearful as well.
Yeah, and Yvonne is sort of a legend in Virginia. So you had some big shoes to fill.
That's the exact words I use. These are giant shoes to fill. She is a legend. I've looked up to her since I was 19 or 20 years old is when I first started working. So I've looked up to her, admired her, and thought, how in the world can I take this on? And, I'm afraid of public speaking. So that was a big hurdle that I knew I would have to overcome.
So what was that like? How did you how did you transition from being mom to full-time homeschool hero in Virginia?
Well, fortunately, we telecommute primarily. I live up here in Loudoun County. We're based in Richmond. So I'm able to be home most of the time. As a homeschool mom, you're used to working from home too. You're working night and day. So that was natural. And fortunately, Yvonne had been trying to retire for many years. So it wasn't as if she needed to be out the door tomorrow. So we set up kind of a baton handoff where each month I took on one more day of her job and she took on one less. And so we kind of did this 5-month transition. And still, I asked if she would stay as my mentor. And then she's a strategic advisor for us. So we still have access to her wit and wisdom.
We're right in the middle of a heavy legislative season all around the country, but it was pretty hot and heavy in Virginia. Tell us about that.
Yeah, this year was quite unique. In fact, one of my friends, Joe Garino, who used to be a lobbyist for HEAV, sent me an email and he said, wow, baptism by fire. There was a bill introduced by a senator next county over in Fairfax, Senator Pekarsky, Senate Bill 1031. And initially this bill was just stripped religious exemption.
Well, let's back up. So people around the country, in Virginia, we have a homeschool statute and there is another thing called religious exemption. So explain the difference between those two.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. Most homeschoolers in Virginia utilize our homeschool statute. So there's compulsory attendance. You need to attend school in some way. Homeschooling is one of the legal ways of doing that. Most homeschoolers choose that option. But pre-existing the legalization of homeschooling in Virginia, we have what's called a religious exemption law. And it's one of the best laws in the country, in my humble opinion. But it was based on conscientious objector laws. And it allowed you to completely exempt your children from any compulsory attendance at all. And so this bill was a direct attack on this means of religious exemption. And, it was interesting because there was some division in the ranks when this happened, because most people do use what we call our notice of intent law, is what we call it in Virginia. Most people do use that. And I thought, well, what's the big deal? They can just take some tests. But it's not about the tests. Religious liberty is foundational to the United States of America. And even before that, Virginia had, religious liberty enshrined. So.
And just full disclosure, my family moved here in 2001. So all 7 of my children were homeschooled under the religious exemption rules here in Virginia, and it's it's a liberty that we have here in Virginia, and your organization and mine, we would never want to have a step back where liberties are taken away, and that's what this bill really was about. It was about taking away something that works. I mean, thousands and thousands of children have been homeschooled under the religious exemption statute. I think you mentioned that one of your children, your older children, is now in college. My kids went to college. They're all successful adults. So it's not like, you don't have to do the notice of intent, but parents, because they, this is going to surprise a lot of our listeners.
Right. Parents,
because they love their kids, are going to do what's best for them. And in Virginia, the religious exemption statute gave us, my family and others, great flexibility and enormous liberty to do what was best for our kids. So that's why we, objected to, an attempt to kind of roll back freedom.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. Parents almost all the time try to do best for their children, and to use religious exemption in Virginia, it's a public process in some ways. You need to, it's administered differently than the homeschool law. The homeschool law in Virginia is an administrative process. It's a notice. It's not permission. And it's administered by the superintendent's offices around the state. But if you are filing for a religious exemption, the law says you need to go to the school board, which is a publicly elected body. And they're subject to FOIA and other things. So you're really making a strong statement that you really mean this. Some of the attacks against religious exemption that, there's not enough government oversight and things like this. There's just nothing to support that parents don't do best for their children.
So you mentioned that it started out as an effort to repeal the religious exemption. What did it turn into?
Yeah, so it kind of went through these different phases and iterations, and it was interesting when it was just the religious exemption. I had mentioned there was some division among the ranks. And we came out immediately from the get-go. HEAV did with HSLDA. We coordinated. I worked a lot with Scott Woodruff and others, but we had a very coordinated attack that an attack on religious exemptions, an attack on all homeschoolers. And so, I'm sure, having been involved in, legislative process and politics for many years, knew from the get-go this is a slippery slope. And so we came out very publicly, very strong. And sure enough, that's exactly what came next. So the next iteration, they swore this was it. This was all they were going to do. And then, what's really interesting is the first committee hearing they had, HSLDA, HEAV rallied the troops. We said, show up in force. We had stickers printed. We told everybody to wear red. And that room, the big committee room, was so packed. There were people in the hallways and all about. You couldn't fit everybody in there. And so they chose to punt hearing the bill. All those people there. And we had encouraged people to bring their children to be part of the process. And they punted it. But what was interesting is the day that bill was supposed to be heard, President Biden was still in office, and he had issued a proclamation of Religious Liberty Day, of National Religious Liberty Day that day. And then there they punt it. So the next bill that came out as they were playing all these maneuvering games really was an attack on all homeschoolers. It changed the homeschooling process. It added a whole bunch of requirements. It added new terms that are undefined in law, where superintendents would be in a position of determining abuse situations when they're unqualified. It really just was tentacles all through the homeschool law. And so, we just kept people rallied. And in Virginia, since COVID, I ran some numbers, and about 40% of homeschoolers now in Virginia, based on numbers, were not homeschooling pre-COVID. So that's a gravitational shift in culture of people who have never had to defend their homeschool freedom, never had to, it was just there. And so, the quote, I'm sure, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. And so, this was an opportunity for all these new homeschoolers to really come to value what we have. And they did. They really rose up. All sorts of people who had never been involved in the political process, never come down to the Capitol, never written or called a legislator, did so.
Yeah, that's a really important point, that the homeschool movement began kind of under siege and had to fight and claw to get its a foothold. But today's new homeschoolers don't have that experience or that history, and so to get them activated, something like this, can really get people charged up again, because, as you said, lots of people began homeschooling during COVID, discovered how much it was, how good it was for their kids and for their families. And then to hear that the freedom that they've discovered just recently is about to be rolled back. It's really exciting that you were able to activate a lot of new people. That's a great report. Tell us about the working relationship between HEAV and HSLDA and other groups, working together to coordinate and fight this bad bill.
Yeah. So I really looked at this. One of my favorite Bible verses is Romans 8:28, and all things God works for the good of those who love him. So I saw this as a tremendous opportunity for good to have, as you said, all these people value this. So I had mentioned Scott Woodruff, who is Virginia's attorney, and I coordinate a lot. So we had coordinated before session on several bills that were introduced by different members of the legislature. The focus ended up being shift primarily away from those, but we coordinated on the messages that we would send out because we needed consistent messaging. We needed to let people know what to do. For example, often you'll write your delegate or senator, and we made the decision we wanted them to call. We wanted the phones ringing off the hook. There's, kind of a psychological difference there. You can't just set up a rule and have them all disappear somewhere. And so sure enough, I talked to a couple senators and I said, how many people have called your office? One senator told me over 2,000. Another senator told me over 3,000. And I think here's some perspective is important. When I used to work as a legislative aide, if we got 15 or 20 calls or emails on an issue, we knew to pay attention. If we got 50 to 100, it was a big issue. I mean, we were doing press releases. This is thousands of calls. So I asked, how many did you get in favor of this? 6. The answer was 6. So people were fired up. Scott and I worked on, when and where to have people show up, what the messaging was, who they were going to call, because, we specifically targeted, whatever committee members were going to be hearing the bill, the patron, the chairman of committees, things like that.
So, what was the motivation behind this bill if it had so very little public support?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the language for the initial bill has actually been in, there's an organization called VSBA, Virginia School Board Association. And they're like this strange pseudo government that gets tax money, but there's no public disclosure. They put forward a legislative package. And most school boards in Virginia are members of this Virginia School Board Association. So they've had this attack on a smaller version of the attack on religious exemption in their language for many years. But really, there's another organization called CRHE, the Coalition for Responsible Home Education, that kind of pushed this forward. And interestingly, when I came on board with HEAV in 2023, I was warned about this organization to keep an eye on them, to get on their email list. And then HSLDA has been, very good about getting communication out from your attorneys to the different state organizations about what they're up to. And this past summer, they came out with this giant, in July, this giant legislative package called the Make Homeschool Safe Act. And it's 20 some pages, 23, 24 pages of, model policy language. And so we analyzed it in-house. You guys analyzed it and discussed what threats we saw coming. They also, shortly thereafter, released this invisible child database, which was their, they had collected times where children happened to be abused and homeschooled. Interestingly, though, HSLDA has been great about getting the word out that there has not been a case yet found where there's not been a lapse in social services responsibility or activity. Anyway, so we were on the lookout for this legislation. And then in addition to that, with the name Invisible Child Database, naturally, I think the political side of me, having worked in politics all these years, you're thinking ahead. Okay, well, what do we need to do to thwart this? Well, we need to be visible then. So we had a day at the Capitol in the fall where we, have people come down to Richmond, our members, and then we had a couple more scheduled in January. So we really started to get the word out to our members. And I know you guys did too. We need to be visible. We need to be off session, calling your delegates, calling your senators, showing your face to them, letting them see who you are. Be visible so that when these attacks come, and they will, they know what they're up against. And we weren't expecting it to be so soon or so mighty.
So the they call it a database, but it's really a collection of news stories and anecdotes collected over decades. And they do capture some sort of tragic and heart-wrenching stories that our hearts kind of go out to those families and the children that were involved. But all of the research, and it's been done by some independent researchers who have actually no connection to homeschooling but have an academic interest in homeschooling, and others, they say Make Homeschooling Safe Act, which sort of begins with the presumption that homeschooling isn't safe. But none of the academic research, none of the social science, none of the data that comes out of the federal government, nowhere has it ever been demonstrated, in fact, just the opposite, that children who are homeschooled are any less safe. In fact, children who attend public schools have to go through that, the most stated reason that people today choose to homeschool is because of safety concerns in the public school. So, just to kind of put a finishing touch on that thought, we grieve for children who are abused in any setting, and we acknowledge that, homeschooling is done by parents, and parents aren't always perfect. But if you compare one form of education, the public school system to the homeschooling system, kids in homeschools are much more safe than kids who go to the public schools. So this group that published the Make Homeschooling Safe Act, they have a different worldview. They have an ideology. And, we just have to acknowledge that, where we come from the idea that liberty is good, parents love their children, want to do what's best for them. They come from a worldview that says, let's don't trust parents. Let's make sure that the government has more and more control. And these bills that they're trying to get introduced around the country now, like the one here in Virginia or Illinois. There's one that just was introduced in Kentucky. They're one step at a time. They want to greatly restrict the freedom of parents to homeschool. And they're kind of in league with Elizabeth Bartholet, who wrote a law review article a few years ago in 2020. Harvard law professor wrote a law review article saying that homeschooling should be banned because, by and large, parents who choose to homeschool aren't good people, and we shouldn't trust them. So, we're in a clash of worldviews that's bigger than a single piece of legislation. And the folks on the other side of this question are dedicated, talented, and they're not going away. So we all have to, kind of bring our A game to make the case for why liberty is a good thing, and why homeschool freedom, in Virginia, you had two options, the statute or the religious exemption. We don't want to give any freedom up, ever. We think it's a good thing. So what ended up happening with the bill? It was quite a lot going on for a pretty short time. But how did it all end up?
Yeah. So what ended up happening is, with the firestorm. So let me first explain that homeschooling has become a partisan issue in a way that it should not be. We're a 501c3. We don't get involved in partisan politics. And initially, interestingly, the religious exemption statute that we have now in Virginia was introduced by a Democrat, who eventually became governor. So this really shouldn't be a partisan issue. However, it has become that. Because this has become, as you had said, a clash of worldviews. And the people in this organization, many of them we found were disgruntled homeschoolers. They had a bad homeschool situation or experience themselves. And rather than taking issue with their parents or whatever caused the bad situation, they're taking issue with the institution of homeschooling. And so, we did learn they intend to continue to pursue this, but this bill morphed, the partisanship became more and more apparent. And in Virginia this year, we have the House of Delegates up for election and the governor is up for election. Now, right now, our only backstop with this bill, because had it gone through the legislature, our Governor Youngkin, had guaranteed a veto. But the reason it didn't make it through is because the House members are up for re-election, and they saw thousands and thousands of people calling the Senate. And the Speaker of the House said, I don't want our people voting on this, because he knew that, unfortunately, that we didn't hear word of a single Democrat who said they would vote against it. So they just didn't want to have to cast a vote at all. And so they ended up killing it. Now, the final version of the bill, they tried to back it off from being any type of law to being a study. And this study, it was kind of a kangaroo court idea. I mean, you had the stakeholders on it were people involved in public schooling and no real interest in homeschooling. You had our organization was supposed to have a stakeholder, and then a member of the CRHE organization, which very few people have ever heard of. And I had the opportunity, as we were walking out of committee, to grab Senator Pekarsky and ask her, why wouldn't you include HSLDA as one of the stakeholders? You guys have been around for over 40 years. Why not? And she said, who? And she's one who claimed to be a homeschooler herself. And I wondered, I said, Homeschool Legal Defense Association. She said, I've not heard of them. So I don't know how that is. I know that Scott had been down there testifying and working, and, we tried several times to meet, but nevertheless, it became this study that was going to cost money. And not knowing who HSLDA is like saying you're a cereal manufacturer, but you've never heard of Cheerios, right? So I think the fact that it wasn't going to go anywhere, they didn't want to vote on it in the House, finally pulled it back. While we were waiting for that final vote, though, the lobbyist for CRHE happened to be milling about outside of the committee room, and I had the opportunity to talk to her a little bit. And they fully intend to bring this bill back in Virginia. And I would say a message that I want to share with everybody is that be visible message that we had talked about, that both of our organizations are talking about, that really we need as homeschoolers between now and next legislative session, next January, and ideally before the elections in November, to be visible. Our delegates and senators are only down in Richmond in session 2 months a year, January and February. The rest of the year, they're nearby you, and call them up and ask to swing by their office, bring them, some cookies, or invite them to Chick-fil-A with you, invite them to your homeschool co-op, or just let them see happy, healthy, thriving homeschoolers, so that, when next year comes around, hopefully they won't want to. The other reason this is important is, you had mentioned other states. What's happening in Illinois right now is really bad nationally for homeschooling, and Kentucky's a tough state with homeschooling already. But this organization is relatively unknown to the greater public, unlike HSLDA. And so this was their first debut, if you will. And we did very well, very effectively shut them down. If Illinois and Kentucky, or if their next few attempts, we are able to shut them down, then we can really take the wind out of their sails, hopefully on a national level. But if they're able to pick up traction in a state or two, it's not going to stop. There's a clash of worldviews here that.
Yeah, I wanted to go back and talk to you about, just address something you said, that it's become a partisan issue, and in some ways that's true. In other ways, it's really not and shouldn't be, because people from all across the ideological spectrum choose to homeschool, and once they do, they discover, how well it works for their children. And these artificial restrictions that get, that are being pushed. Everybody, nobody really wants to be under those kind of restrictions. And if the Elizabeth Bartholet's of the world had their way, I mean, I wouldn't qualify for any of her exemptions. She would have banned my family from homeschooling, and probably, 95% or more of families who homeschool wouldn't be able to if this worldview catches on and takes hold. So, we work with folks all across the political and ideological spectrum. And, you see, especially since COVID, homeschooling has become enormously popular amongst Black parents.
That's right.
And
the fastest growing population.
Yeah. And it's because, I think COVID just changed the world. People had an opportunity to see what it would be like and discovered how much, it would benefit their family. And because the restrictions that used to be in place have been rolled back to such an extent that it's not as scary to begin homeschooling. And there's so many resources for parents. There's so many, state organizations all over the country. Like HEAV has this enormous network of local groups.
That's right.
And if you're new to homeschooling, you don't know how, HEAV can put you in touch with somebody in your neighborhood who can give you a hand. So today it's just a completely different setup than it was even when my family started homeschooling years ago. And it's really important that this is a freedom movement. It's not a partisan movement. It's a movement based on the love of children, the desire to give children the best opportunity to become successful adults. Many of us homeschool for religious reasons to help our kids, grow in the faith. There's just so many positives that we need to just stick with the positive. Well, we need to really make sure that the positive message gets out. And you're talking about visible. Yeah. States all over the country. I know you guys do in Richmond, and day after tomorrow in Springfield, Illinois, they call it their Cherry Pie Day. Yes. And because what's going on right now, I'm told, and it will have happened by the time this podcast is released, but I'm told that they have like quadruple the registrations that they normally have for a Capitol Day.
Yeah, I was at a conference late last week, and there were quite a few people from the Illinois State Organization. And I mean, they also have been able to rally enormous numbers. And people from all different socioeconomic backgrounds homeschool, all different, even, we're talking about one type of clash of worldview, but there, are all sorts of views. You also mentioned the growth in, the Hispanic and the Black population. The special needs population has really, gotten huge, because really every home education is an individual education plan. But, I had the opportunity during this battle to interview and have a conversation with our Lieutenant Governor, Winsome Sears, who was talking about Brown versus Board of Education. And one of the things, among some of the Black families we've talked to, the grandparents don't like the idea of their children homeschooling, because they were of the generation where they had to fight to gain access to the public schools. And so it hurts their hearts to imagine now they see, their grandchildren, great-grandchildren being pulled out. But Winsome Sears, she said so eloquently, she said, Brown versus Board of Education was not about the brick walls. It was about providing your children with the best education that you could for them. And that's what homeschooling has, allowed us to do. You talked about the resources as well. We do have a huge convention every year, 11, 12,000 people. We have, all different outreach for the different communities, how to begin homeschooling, an enormous curriculum fair, used curriculum fair, children's activities. It's always the first first weekend in June down at the Richmond Convention Center. And it's a wonderful opportunity to come see other homeschoolers, hear speakers, expose yourself to curriculum. But we're here year round too. I mean, our office, we're here not quite 365, but pretty close. And we have phone counselors, who you can call and say, I need to find a curriculum. I need to find a support group. I have a special needs kid, or I need support in this area. And that's what we do, is we want to equip parents. None of us, are capable of providing everything our child needs for education, but our job is to find it for them and to love them best.
Yeah. And the way you describe it just really reminds me that, there's no governor or president or Congress that said, okay, here's the law. You must now create all these homeschool things. And we're not funded by the government. We're not dictated by the government. You came into homeschooling as a interest, working for Senator Dick Black, then as a mom, and now like me, it's your life's work. But it's the homeschooling community is something that we created ourselves to meet the needs of our kids, to meet the needs of our friends. And it's become this enormous kind of vibrant ecosystem of, if you can't find a place for your needs to be met here, it's probably over there.
That's right.
And there's always somebody that can help you. And it's just a wonderful study, really. I always say that the homeschooling movement is the single most successful social movement of my lifetime because of what we built together.
Yeah. And, when you think about it, it's really unnatural to be segregated by the year you were born for years on end. Never again in your life will you, be told, oh, you were born this year, these are your people, and that is it. It's very unnatural. It's natural to be with older people and younger people and people of all different walks of life. And homeschooling allows that beauty. I have a son who is becoming a welder. I have another son who's an organist, a church organist. But meanwhile, they played baseball. They went to formal dances. You're not boxed into your clique or your interest group. In homeschooling, you're, able to explore all these different facets of your personality and interests and gifts.
Well, Callie, thanks for talking to us about this was one of the more interesting legislative seasons in Virginia in a long time. And as you said, I think our opponents may come back and we may have to do this all over again, which means we have to be strong. We have to be smart. We have to be wise. We have to be winsome. So
Yes.
Winsome Sears, she lives out in my area over in the Shenandoah Valley. And she's a really interesting and wonderful lady. So how do people find you at HEAV and here in Virginia? And then just say a word for the folks in other states, how important it is to plug in with their state homeschool groups.
Yeah, thank you. So our website is heav.org for Home Educators Association of Virginia. My contact information is there, or it's C. Chaplow at HEAV. We're on Facebook and Instagram and X and all over the place. Our convention information is on there. I really do encourage people to come the first day. If it's, you're just exploring, it's free. It's well worth it. But nationwide, and in Virginia, it goes for all places. Being visible, really, it sounds so intimidating to call up your delegate or senator. But there's one thing that politicians value more than money, and that's votes. And that's what you are. So they want to hear from you. as a constituent. You're a voter. Usually I know every state has a way to figure out who is my delegate, who is my senator. We even encouraged, and I had my own children many times over the years, call them themselves. So please oppose this, please support that. Most states have a Capital Day, you had mentioned, where kind of homeschoolers get together and converge on the Capitol, really try to participate in that. But you don't need a Capital Day to go down to the Capitol. It's your house. I had one gentleman say, we said, "Oh, go visit your delegate or senator." He said, "Well, I'm not a lobbyist." And so that would be a message. You don't have to be a lobbyist. This is your house. Go introduce yourself. And figure out, when election times come around, ask both candidates, or if there's more, ask them, how do you feel about homeschooling? How would you vote on these different things? Get their commitment. I would encourage people to invite them to their graduation ceremonies or different events.
Well, thank you. My guest today is Callie Chaplow, the Director of Government Affairs at Home Educators Association of Virginia. And for those of you who are in other states, if you come to our website at hslda.org, we have a page where you can find a link to your state organization. And we have a legislative toolbox as well, so you can find out who your representatives and senators are. And you can sign up for our emails, where we will send out alerts. If anything's happening in your state, we'll let you know about it. I'd really encourage you all to sign up for those. And then we have a weekly email that we call it the weekly update, that you can sign up for as well. So thanks again. This has been another episode of Homeschool Talks. If you'd like to join HSLDA as a member or donate to our cause, you can do that at hslda.org. So until next time, I'm Jim Mason, President of Homeschool Legal Defense Association.
Today's program is made possible by HSLDA's Member Savings Program. Did you know that your HSLDA membership can pay for itself with our specially negotiated discounts on products and services? You can save on expenses like rental cars, hotel reservations, technology, curriculum, school supplies, and more. And we're continually adding more discounts. Visit our website at hslda.org/member savings for an up-to-date list. That's hslda.org/member savings. Thanks for listening to this episode of Homeschool Talks. If you've enjoyed this conversation, will you do us a favor by sharing it with a friend or leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts? As a reminder, you can find show notes for this episode along with our other Homeschool Talks conversations at hslda.org/podcast. And if you want to be the first to know about new episodes, as well as upcoming guests and topics, you can sign up for our email list using the link in the show notes. That's all for now. We hope you enjoyed this program, and we'll see you next time.